Hi everyone, welcome back from spring break. I graded your midterms and they should be all up on Canvas. I sent an email about them. If you have a 0 next to your midterm grade and you sent me a midterm, so that's a mistake, just contact me because that means I either had an issue opening your exam and emailed you about it and didn't hear back, or else I never received an exam. But if you sent one, that's fine. We can just talk about it and you can send it to me again. Um, I know I've said this in email, but I'll just say this again. You have a quiz on April 2nd. It's going to be online. It's going to be on Canvas, obviously, since everything is online. And if you have special accommodations, then I'm sending you a different quiz, one that gives you more time. Okay. I'm going to do lectures for the rest of the semester by topic. And I know I've said this in email as well, but I'll just repeat it. So some of the lectures will be longer or shorter. They're not going to be confined to the 1 hour and 20-minute time. That doesn't mean you have to watch, like if a lecture ends up as 2 hours or something, you can break it up into pieces. But I just think it'll be better if I do like population and migration all in one sitting, and then we'll come back to language and all of our different topics for the rest of the semester. So, what are our topics going to be for the rest of the semester? First, we're going to do population and migration today. And population is a really important part of human geography, and it's also a really important part of understanding the world in general. There are a lot of misconceptions about population and migration, and so I want to make sure that we discuss those and break apart that single narrative that we're always trying to break apart. And then for the rest of the semester, we're in the section of the class where we deal with a lot of different human issues. So throughout the class, we looked at globalization, we looked at regional economic growth, and now we're looking at humans. And obviously, we've been looking at humans the whole time, but we're looking like purely at human constructs. Although population obviously isn't purely a human construct, but we're going to discuss population, and then we're going to have a lecture on language. And I like to set these two topics up when going into human geographies because both of them look at like a large overarching theme of population. Population, we're going to look at why population grows, what some of our misconceptions are about it, what's going to happen with population, what the real concern is with population. We're going to touch a little bit on migration. And then our next lecture is going to be on language. And with language, and this is what's kind of difficult about doing it online, is with language, what I really like is a lot of feedback. It's much better when we're in the classroom and we're able to kind of discuss certain words and why those words affect us so much. And I'm going to try my best to do it online without being too controversial since it's being recorded. But as you know, in this class, what we do is we look at the profane and the sacred. And we want to break those two concepts apart, those things that are profane and those things that are sacred, because if we don't break them apart and analyze them, if something is too sacred to be analyzed and investigated, well, then that just allows for a whole lot of things to be hidden in it, like the Catholic Church, which is an example I've given before in class. And if things are too profane that our ears can't listen to them, whether it's talking about things that we think in polite society isn't something you're supposed to talk about, sex or alcohol or drugs or whatever, well, then again, we can investigate it and how it affects us. So with language, it's a great way to set up looking at human geographies because language tells us so much about our culture. There's the part of language that is just about, the definition of language being an agreed upon set of sounds and signals that have some meaning. And we both agree that the words that I'm saying right now equal the words that you're intuiting them to be. But there's this whole other part of language that's hidden. One part of it is in our body language, and there's different different sayings like 90% of communication is body language. Um, and there's also the way that certain words come to encapsulate so much in culture, like racism, like misogyny, like classism, like ageism, like all kinds of stuff. And often it's not so much those words, but what those words represent. And so I want to look at why some of those words represent what they represent and how highly cultural they are. You know, if you think of the worst words to call somebody in the English language, whether it's a word that is a racial epithet or a word that is a misogynistic term, whatever it is, it's highly cultural. And if you go to a different culture and call somebody that same name, it often doesn't have any impact on them at all because it's something that lives within our culture. So that's what we're going to explore in our next lecture. And then we're going to get into gender, and we're going to get into race, and then we're going to talk ethnicity. We're going to discuss, so we've got gender, we've got race and racism, we've got ethnicity, we've got religion, and then we have some cultural processes, things like what happens when people die. Not like what do I believe happens when they die, but things like different funeral customs, different housing customs, stuff like that. It's kind of a general hodgepodge of cultural processes. And I think that's it for the semester. Oh, of course not. Sexuality. That's another one that goes in there. So from here to the end of the semester, we're talking population, we're talking language, we're talking gender, race and racism, ethnicity, sexuality, and then religion, and kind of a cultural hodgepodge of processes that are unique to different cultures. Okay? All right, so I have two quotes for you. One, it's not brave to refuse to pay attention, to refuse to notice, to refuse to know and imagine. The opposite of, that should say of, sensitive is insensitive, and that's no badge of honor. I thought that was a good quote for our circumstances right now. Circumstances with our global pandemic, but also circumstances with anything, with climate change, with misogyny, with racism, whatever it is, it's not brave to refuse to pay attention. And then you say it's 11, we all got to eat, but you're here alone. There's no one to compete. I thought that was kind of on point for our state of isolation right now. Okay, so extra credit before the end of the semester. Here are 4 because we can't do a hike once again. Very sad. But here are 4 different movies you can watch. Not My Life is about trafficking. The Breadwinner is so Not My Life is on Amazon. The Breadwinner is on Netflix, and The Breadwinner is based on a book. It's about this family living in the Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. It's fictional and it's animated, but it is so good. So please watch it. One Child Nation is on Amazon, and it's about China and what happened with the one-child policy. We're talking population today, and China is going to come into that for sure. Also, there's a John Oliver news piece that I put on Canvas that I want you to watch along with this lecture. So One Child Nation gets more into what has happened with the one-child policy in China, and if you don't know what that is, we're going to discuss it. And then Searching for Sugar Man. This is my favorite documentary ever. It's on Netflix. It's about a musician. It's much better if you go into this movie not knowing anything about it. Trust me on that. Just watch it. It's incredible. Okay, so same for all of these. Write a 1-page analysis of them, and that's extra credit. All right, so we're talking population. And population, like I said, is something that is very important to human geography, obviously, since the definition of human geography, or the title human geography, has human in it. So how many humans we have is obviously going to be an essential part to geography. But population is something that is often misused or misunderstood. So I want to get into different, so we're going to look at population fundamentals. We're going to look at total fertility and what's happening in the world with population. We're going to look at different policies that have been created and different sort of ideas around curbing population. But first, I want to introduce the idea that we blame population for a lot. People tend to blame population for kind of all the ills in the world. If we look at climate change, oh, it's too many people in the world. If we look at food shortages, there's too many people in the world. Even right now with our global pandemic, people would probably say, oh, it's because there's so many people in the world, especially since it came out of China. So it's like there's too many people in China and they did something and that just has created this global pandemic. So I argue in class, and we would be having this discussion if we were in class, that it's not so much about numbers. And this isn't just my idea that it's not about numbers. This is statistical. This is all kinds of different things. It's not about numbers. It's about consumption. So it's not so much about just pure quantities of people. It's about how much we're consuming. Because if you look at how we talk about population, and I'll use my dad as an example. This is the example I usually use in class. How my dad, and I think I've talked about my dad enough for you to get an idea of what kind of a terrible person he is. But when I was growing up, he would always say things like, there's too many people in the world. There's too many people. He was never talking about himself. He was never talking about himself or his right to procreation or his right to live life the way he wants to live it. He was always talking about other people. And those people tended to be in this part of the world. Even though my dad, has barely worked in his life. He worked as a cab driver for a long time. He worked as a pilot, and as a pilot, he flew a bunch of stuff in and out of different places. And he was a crop duster, and he did all these things that were pretty degrading to the environment. And just the way he lives in general is pretty degrading to the environment. He gives very, very little. That's generous. He gives nothing back to the world, and he takes a whole lot. So why was he always complaining about the sheer number of people? Because he was never offering to go jump off a bridge or anything like that. He was talking about people who tended to be from this part of the world. And that part of the world is where I'm circling right now, the low latitudes. Instead of from down here, which is where, he's from, where if you look at this map, there's clearly not a lot of people there. So maybe he thought, it's just my part of the world that's totally fine because we don't have anybody who lives on this entire continent, but look at the rest of the world. But really what was going on is it's just veiled racism. When he, maybe not everybody, but when he would talk about it, it was like, there's too many people who don't look so much like me. And we can do without those people. Rather than looking at the real issues of population, which are consumption, which is consumerism. Because if you look at me and my one child, I only had one child, she takes up the resources. So my one child over here in California takes up the resources of 52 children here in Ethiopia. So one child here, 52 children here. And if that doesn't make sense to you, the idea there is with like my daughter and the food that she eats, the amount that she's driven places, the amount that she's flown different places, the clothes that she wears, the sheer quantity of clothes and of consumer goods that she's had since she was born take up about 52 times the sheer consumer goods of somebody who's from Ethiopia. And as you should remember from when we talked about regional economic growth, Ethiopia isn't the poor place that it was in the 1980s. This is the fastest growing economy in Africa. And it has been since 2010. So when you think about Ethiopia, you might think like, oh, well, that's just dire poverty. It's not quite dire poverty. But my one daughter here, still 52 times the resources of there. And once again, you might think like, well, yeah, that's the difference between a country in North America and a country in Africa. But if you look at, again, my one daughter compared to a Brazilian kid, she's taking up 27 times the resources. So what we're really looking at here is the periphery, the semi-periphery, and the core, and the amount of resources that are taken up in each place. So in the periphery, we're looking at a fraction of the resources of a person living in the core, and we're looking at a slightly more balanced fraction, but still just a fraction of resources in the semi-periphery compared to a person here in the core. Now, you could ask, or hopefully you're thinking, why would we spend so much time worrying about, um, uh, I completely just forgot what I was saying. Sorry. Um, yeah, what was I just gonna say? Hopefully you're thinking resources, my daughter, um, shoot, man, I completely just, see, I don't just do that in the classroom, I do it in my life in general. Start talking about something, then completely forget what I'm talking about. All right, so 52 times the resources Ethiopian child, 27 times the resources Brazilian child. We're looking at the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. And yeah, well, anyway, what I was getting at in general is that we tend to blame sheer numbers rather than blaming consumption. Because if we up here, who are clearly consuming so much more than other parts of the world, if you look at our resources we take up, if you look at the amount of oil that we take up about 25% of the world's oil when we're only 5% of the world's population. If you look at quality of life expectations, and not just in the US, but all through the mid latitudes, they're very different from the low latitudes. And so, one of the reasons that we that we change the narrative from, hey, maybe we shouldn't be consuming so much up here in the mid latitudes, to just the sheer volume of people, is because then we don't have to do anything. Because up here in the US, and if you look at other places in the mid latitudes and the core countries of the world, people are having very few children. They're having, here in the US, we're having 2.1 or 2.4 children per woman. In Italy, they're having 1.2 children per woman. And I hope that that's surprising to you, because Italy's a Catholic country, so usually we think Catholic countries, lots of children, but no, they're not replacing themselves. We're going to talk about the kinds of issues that brings up later. If we look over here in China, well, China famously has had the one-child policy for the last 40 years, which again is very strongly affecting them, and we'll come back to that. Here in Japan, same thing. They're not replacing themselves. They're having less than 2 children per woman. And in fact, this generation, this millennial generation, 40% of the millennial generation in Japan is celibate. Now, celibate voluntarily, for the most part, voluntarily celibate, meaning they're not having sex. So when we're looking at Japan and what's going to happen with Japan's population, there's a whole lot factoring in there. But so when we look at consumption in the world, we look at the issues of the world, see how it would be much easier up here in the mid latitudes to blame sheer numbers, because we are not having that many children. In our head, we think we're doing our part, we're just replacing ourselves. We're just having, for two person couple, that that is what a couple is, so I don't know why I just said it like that. But for a couple, for 2 people, if you have 2 children, then we're doing our part. Whereas down here in Guatemala, you have the average woman having 6 children. And over here in Somalia, the average woman is having 9 children. But then down here in Australia, the average woman is having less than 2 children. So if we focus simply on sheer numbers, then we don't actually have to change our practices at all. And the problem with that is the real problem isn't sheer numbers. The real problem is consumption. Now, that can be an issue for a continent like Africa, but we're going to discuss how that's going to be an issue in a little bit. But first, let's talk about the world. Look, there's the world. Hi, world. Let's talk about our population fundamentals. Try and understand a little bit more of what I'm getting at by claiming that the problems of the world aren't so much sheer numbers, but have to do with consumption. And don't worry, I'm going to come back to how the numbers can be a problem for sure, but just bear with me. All right, so first, in understanding population, first thing is the crude birth rate. Now, the crude birth rate is usually what people refer to when they're talking about population. When somebody like my dad, for example, would say, oh, well, they're having too many children in whatever part of the world. He's talking about the crude birth rate. He's talking about the number of live births per 1,000 people in a population per year. So when I said back here that Somalia, the average woman in Somalia is having 9 children, The average woman in Ethiopia is having 7 children. The average woman over here in Guatemala is having 6 children. That's the crude birth rate. Now, the issue with the crude birth rate is that there's a lot going on there, first of all. With the crude birth rate, that's the number of children that are born in a year, what's supposed to couple along with it is also the death rate. And in places like Somalia, for example, where you are having a whole lot of children, people aren't living that long. In fact, if we looked at Africa as a whole, this entire continent, especially sub-Saharan Africa, and we looked at the median age, like the most common age for sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking at the majority of the population, or sorry, not the majority, the median of the population under 15. So we're looking at a very, very young population. Whereas if we came up here to Canada, the median age is in their 40s, meaning that kind of the most common age that you would find in a Canadian person is in their 40s. So I hope that you can kind of see the difference in that, where in sub-Saharan Africa, the median age, the most sort of, if you think about it, in the most kind of common person you're going to run into is going to be 15 or younger. That tells you something, that while people are having a lot of children, those children aren't necessarily making it into adulthood. And that makes a big difference, once again, with the issue of population. If the issue of population is consumption of resources and you're having a lot of children, but those children aren't living long enough to really consume any resources, well, then again, it's not really about sheer numbers. As opposed to here, where you're having fewer than 2 children per woman in Canada, but those people are living pretty well and for a pretty long time. And so how much are they going to consume over that lifetime? Especially since they live in a wealthy country and they have access to so many more resources and disposable income, and they're able to fly different places and travel different places, increasing their carbon footprint. So when I say that the issue isn't sheer numbers, that's what I'm talking about. Because when you're looking at just sheer numbers, you're missing a huge, big part of the picture. Okay, so the crude birth rate has a whole lot to do also with style of economy. Again, if we look at sub-Saharan Africa, we're looking, as we talked about, we're looking at countries whose economies are developing and developing very fast. Across the continent, we've got about a 5.5% economic growth rate, and in places like Ethiopia, which is growing at about 6% per year. Nigeria is growing about 5% per year, but down here in Rwanda, tiny little country, they're growing at over 7% per year. So their economies right now are set to grow, and that's going to make a big difference with population. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But for now, let's look at just the Africa that's in front of us. So the Africa that's in front of us, sub-Saharan Africa especially, the 65% of the population still is working in agriculture. So if 65% of the population is still working in agriculture, that means that the Green Revolution, that revolution we talked about when we talked about agriculture, has not yet been fully implemented here. Remember, over here in the US, agriculture is still a big part of our economy, but only 4% of our population works in agriculture. If you look at pre-industrial revolution US, then that's when we had 65-70% of our population working in agriculture. See the difference? What we're looking at in sub-Saharan Africa is a part of the world that is set to go into the Industrial Revolution, but is still centered in agriculture. And agriculture requires a lot of labor. And households in this region require a lot of labor. Think about the Hans Rosling washing machine TED Talk that we watched. The one where he talked about his grandmother just a few generations ago living in Sweden, up here in Sweden. Now, we know that Sweden today has a much higher standard of living than Hans Rosling's grandmother would have had. We know that they have so much working for them when it comes to socialized healthcare and a solid economy, although they're suffering right now, not just because of the global pandemic, they were suffering before. By the way, when we talk about social distancing, Swedes were already like very, very happy with social distancing. So I'm pretty sure that the Swedes who are here in Santa Barbara right now are like, yay, finally we can go back to normal and stand like 10 feet away from the person we're talking to. Anyway, So if you remember, Hans Rosling talked about the washing machine and how the washing machine revolutionized the life of his mom. And that was just one appliance. He was using that as an example of one appliance, but all the little things that we've incorporated into our life that has cut down on our demand for labor. Whereas here in the DR Congo, especially in the eastern DR Congo, which is a pretty impoverished place, the average household is going to have to collect firewood or collect dung or collect some sort of material that's going to be their energy source, collect water. You have women and children in the periphery of the world, in the low latitudes of the world, walking an average of 4 miles and bringing back 40 pounds of water. Now, 4 miles of walking in a day, not to mention that heavy load that you're bringing back, plus collection of firewood or something like that, and that's just to get your day started. That's just to get the water and the energy going in your household. That is highly labor intensive. So in a place where you still have that as common practice, well, a lot of children are helpful. That's where when you have this agrarian economy and this labor intensive economy, having a lot of children is actually very helpful to your household and to all the labor that needs to be done in your household. So when we look at the growth of an economy and the movement of an economy from agriculture into industry into the tertiary, like we've talked about throughout the semester, we're also looking at a reduction in children. And that happens for multiple different reasons. One is when you see a population start to transition from agriculture to industry to tertiary, the quality of living goes up, and part of that is now you now have more money to invest in things like healthcare. Your death rate goes down. Your access to water, your access to clean water, your access to education, all of that is presumably going to increase with the growth in the economy of your country. And so, sorry. And so now, with that access to healthcare and with that access, hopefully, to birth control, we start to see the number of children go down. But the other coupled part of it is that you simply don't need that many children when you don't have that much of a labor intensive economy anymore. And you don't need that many children if you have an improved healthcare system that's going to allow you to live past 15. One of the reasons that women in this part of the world, where's my arrow, in Somalia, are having so many children, I mean, there are so many reasons. One is just access to birth control. If you don't have access to birth control, you're not going to be able to choose how many children you would like to have, for one. Two, if you have an increase, if you have a very labor intensive economy, something that's focused in agriculture, well, then you want to have children, like I said, to help out around the house. Three, what do you think the retirement plan is of people who are in this part of the world? So in Somalia, but across the low latitudes, when we think about their quote unquote retirement plan, and I know I've been making a big deal saying people don't necessarily live to adulthood and to old age, but some people do. So if you're thinking, what's going to happen to me in my adulthood and in my old age? Well, you need to have children because that is your retirement plan. And that's going to factor in really big when we talk about China in a little bit. But, and if those children aren't making it past 15, well, then you need to have more children in order to ensure that there's going to be people around you to help you and to take care of you if you get sick or if you get old or et cetera, et cetera. So we're looking at the need for children. We tend to look at just the sheer numbers, ignoring the need for children in a labor-intensive economy, the need for children when they're your retirement plan, and the issue with people not necessarily making it to adulthood and into old age. All right. So, so when we look at our crude birth rate, again, that's the thing that we tend to center on, when this is really not the number that we should be looking at. There's a whole lot of different things that are going to affect the crude birth rate. Things like I just said, labor-intensive, need for a retirement plan, et cetera, and then access to birth control. Now, access to birth control can be relevant in a couple different ways. One is simply just access to birth control. Do you have clinics? Do you have medical facilities? Do you have an expendable economy where you can buy condoms? Think about how expensive condoms are. Think about a person here in Tanzania where the average person is making $280 a year. And a condom, if we were to go to Costco and get our value pack of condoms, then we're looking at a little more cost effective, a little more bang for your buck, if you will, which is each condom is going to be less than $1. But if we're buying a 3-pack at CVS, then we're looking at about $1 per condom. So over here in Tanzania, how much of your $280 are you going to spend on that condom? And obviously you're going to say like, oh, condoms don't necessarily cost the same, but you get the point that I'm trying to make. So a big part of access to something like birth control is simply the access to an expendable income and to the clinics and the places to buy it. But another big part is culture. Another big part is cultural identity and the idea of having children and what it means to have an abortion, or what it means to use Plan B or to use birth control, depending on how your culture might feel about all of those things. And it also tends to do with a quote unquote woman's role in society. That can also affect your access to birth control. So, one is just simple physical access to birth control, the money, and two is cultural access to birth control. Both those things are going to affect your crude birth rate. But what we should be looking at is total fertility rate. Total fertility rate is the total number of children a woman is going to have within her lifetime. So total number of children a woman will have in her lifetime. And this is a little more on point than crude birth rate. Because with crude birth rate, a lot can change in a year or from year to year. You might see right now, actually, just imagine we're all in isolation. If people are in isolation and coupled up right now, do you think we're going to see a baby boom in about 9 months? I mean, if you already have children, definitely not. But that'll be interesting to look at. So the point in that was to say that our crude birth rate can be affected by all kinds of circumstances. Your total fertility rate and your replacement rate. Those are the two numbers we should be paying attention to. The number of children that you're projected to have within your lifetime, and that lifetime for the reproductive lifetime for women is from 14 to 44, or sometimes 15 to 44. And that makes a difference because, again, it isn't so circumstantial, and it has to do with projected economic growth. If you're looking at a place like Ethiopia, where right now the average woman is having 7 children, but we're also looking at economic growth, well, the total fertility rate is going to change in a place like that because with that projected economic growth, that number of children is expected to go down. So while we might be seeing 7 children right now, in 10 years, so when you look at a woman who might be starting to have children in Ethiopia at 20, in 10 years, the number of children that's going to kind of be the average rate might go down with that projected economic growth. So with our total fertility rate and with our replacement level, now this is the number of children that a couple needs to replace themselves. And notice that this number changes. Is that because thruples or polyamory is more normalized in different cultures? No, not so much. I know you know the answer to that. So what is this number all about and why does it change? And think about that for a second. Why does this number change from 2.1, which would be the replacement level here in the US, or the replacement level in Japan, or the replacement level in Australia, or in the replacement level of the UK, or somewhere like that, as opposed to 3.4, which would be the replacement level in a place like Botswana, or Namibia, or Bolivia, or Thailand, or somewhere like that. And so what's going on here? Think about it. Maybe you've come to your answer. But what's going on here is we have a difference in life expectancy. In a place like Bolivia, there is a higher likelihood that you're not going to make it to adulthood. So once again, if we're going to replace ourselves, we're talking about replacing ourselves as adults, not necessarily replacing ourselves as babies. So if you have a higher death rate, well, then this replacement level is going to go up. That's why that number changes. So what are some of the things that influence fertility? We've talked about them, like the difference in economy. If you have a labor-intensive economy, then that's something where more children is going to be seen as a necessary part of your daily life, of your survival. And I want you guys to take a minute on Canvas. I posted a bunch of videos, and those videos have to do with the topics we're going over from now until the end of the semester. So I would like, if you could, to pause and go watch the Hans Rosling video that I posted on Canvas. If you remember him, he's the guy who talked about the washing machine. I posted a different TED Talk by him about population growth. So if you would watch that now and then come back, that would be good. So why this number changes, we've already talked about a little bit, but things like access to birth control and things like cultural ideas around how many children you should be having, what's normal. And this cultural factor is something that is really important in population. So much of the time when we talk about population, we talk about like sheer kind of technical parts of population. What is the economy? What is the access to birth control? You know, how how readily available are condoms and diaphragms? People still use diaphragms. Birth control pills, all of that good stuff. And how normalized is it? But a big issue with this factor influencing fertility is also, like I said, cultural. and cultural with the idea that that you might live in a society that just thinks that birth control is bad, or somehow links birth control to not fulfilling your destiny as a female. Or I remember this one time I was walking into Planned Parenthood when I was much younger, and these people stopped me, people protesting outside, and they said something about abortion, blah blah blah. And then this woman said to me, you know, even using birth control is a form of abortion because you're stopping the sperm from getting to the egg. And I remember thinking, what? But that is a concept people might have, and we could talk about that for so long. The idea of, well, does that mean that you shouldn't ever masturbate because every time you masturbate you have, I mean, for men, not so much for women. But does that mean that men should never masturbate? Because men, every time, if they're just throwing away all those potential babies, is that somehow an abortion? You know, we could talk about that side of it. We could talk about all kinds of stuff with the idea that not permitting the sperm to meet the egg is a form of abortion, is pulling out a form of abortion, etc., etc. So that cultural concept, that's something that influences fertility. But another big part of what's influencing our fertility is also the what happens with the demographic transition model. So I'm going to come back to these, don't worry. I'll explain what all this is in just a minute. But the demographic transition model is one of the ways that we look at how population grows. So there's 4 stages to the demographic transition model. And let me show you in a different slide. This is a different way to look at the demographic transition model once again. Look at the 4 stages. And then this, and this is my favorite way, so we're going to stick with this for a minute. So the demographic transition model, or theory, is a way that we look at how population is going to grow within a different country. So if we look at a country like let's say the Central African Republic, which is a pre-industrial economy, one that has not industrialized. So you're going to have that labor-intensive household that I described. You're going to have the majority of the population, over majority population, working in agriculture. You're going to have a high birth rate because of lack of access to birth control, but also because of the demand for labor in your household, and you're going to have a high death rate. And that death rate has to do with, as you know, what a death rate would have to do with, but a death rate could be if you have war, if you have famine, if you don't have access to, basic things to cure malaria or malaria pills, if you don't have access to clean water. You know, you're looking at people who are dying from waterborne illnesses in pre-industrial countries. You're going to have a high death rate. So with our high death rate and our high birth rate, the population stays kind of stagnant. So you might have a high birth rate, like in Somalia, but you don't have a growing population in Somalia. While Somalia has 9 children being born per woman, their population is not growing because of their high death rate. And so then what happens, what tends to happen in different countries, is you start to transition from a pre-industrial to an industrialized economy. So now we start to industrialize, and now we have a greater range of personal income. Hopefully, with that industrial economy, we see more people working in a it's still labor intensive, of course. I'm not trying to say that working in industry isn't labor intensive, but it's a different type of labor intensive. Hopefully, the economy of your country is growing so that access to healthcare goes up, access uh, to other things like a regular access to food and clean water. All of that's going to start to develop with this transitional phase, and so we're going to start to see our death rate decline. And now in this second phase, we have a declining death rate, but we still have a high birth rate. Now you might ask why that is. Why do we still have a high birth rate if we are transitioning from an economy over here that's labor intensive, that doesn't have access to birth control, but with this transition, we're getting more access to healthcare. So that should come with access to birth control. That should come with fewer children being born. And so these two should decline together. The big factor in here is culture. This is where I said that culture is something that we often ignore when we're looking at population growth, and we tend to look at the economy and just sheer access. But culture is a big part of it. If you live in a culture, and if we were in class right now, I would ask people how many children they want to have if they want to have children. And more people are saying they don't want to have children. And to those of you who know what you want, well then yay. Don't let anybody tell you that that's not what you want. Because people will say, oh, you just don't know yet. No, if you know, you know. But the people who do want to have children, they tend to have two different numbers. And those numbers are 2, so 2 children, or 3, 4, 5. I know that those are many different numbers, but 2 sets of numbers is what I'm trying to say. And those 2 sets of numbers tend to correlate with 2 different things. This is what I've picked up on in 12 years of teaching, is that either you go along with 2 because that's the cultural norm. If you think about it, people want to have 2 children, they want to have a boy and a girl. I'm not saying you, I'm saying basic. If we think of our basic people, we want to have a boy and a girl. We're going to name them Connor and Cody or some shit like that. And that's going to be our complete family. The other set of numbers that I tend to notice when I ask people how many children they want to have has to do with how many siblings they have. If people come from a household with 3 siblings, they tend to want to have 4 children. Or sometimes those are the opposite and they tend to want to have no children at all. But do you see how much of a factor that is? That when we think about how many children we're going to have, very little of it has to do with, well, are we going to make it to adulthood? Are they going to make it to adulthood? Do we need their labor in the household? Do I have access to birth control? Very little of what comes into our reasoning when we think how many children we want to have has to do with those the way that we tend to view population growth. Because a huge factor in how many children we want to have has to do with just what is the cultural norm. And now the cultural norm goes along with economy and access to healthcare and stuff like that, but it clearly takes a minute for our culture to catch up with what's going on in our economy and with our access to healthcare. And I think that's because you don't necessarily see the declining death rate as it's happening. You don't necessarily see the declining death rate in one generation. It takes you a minute before you have faith as a parent to think like, oh yeah, my children are going to make it into adulthood. The cultural norm is now that we can have access to birth control and that people are going to, live a healthy life, a mostly healthy life. So now I'm going to start having fewer children. Do you see what I'm saying? So our death rate starts to go down because of access to things like nutritional foods and clean water, but it takes us a minute for our culture to catch up. And this is the problem right here. That is the problem with population. So when we talk about the issue with population, this is the problem. It's not crude birth rate. It's not simply sheer numbers and how many children we're having. It's this gap that happens right here. And this gap is what leads to population growth. What's happening with, like, let's take my dad again as an example, because he's a great example of terrible things. So he has a dad, had a dad for sure. His dad would be like 132 right now, so he's no longer alive. But his dad had 10 brothers. 10 brothers. 10 brothers. And my dad is one of one that we know of. His dad was a merchant marine and sailed all over the world, so I wouldn't be surprised if I had like an uncle in Thailand, an uncle in Ghana, an uncle in every other port in the world. But as far as we know, my dad is the only one of his dad's children and his mom's as well. And so, what happened just in that one generation from my dad's dad having, 10 siblings to my dad having 0 siblings was the this transitional phase that happens. There's another factor in there too. The factor being that my grandfather grew up in like a horribly poor part of Scotland, and then had my dad in Australia, which is sometimes called the lucky country because it has been so lucky in its economic growth. but let's pretend that that's not what happened. Let's pretend that they were just living in a country that went from having an agricultural economy to having a industrialized economy. And so from those 10 brothers of my grandfather, we can assume that most of them made it to adulthood. So they would have been born at a time when people weren't making it to adulthood, and they didn't have good access to birth control. So they were having a whole lot of kids. But within his lifetime, and he didn't have my dad till he was 50, he would have seen economy grow, access to birth control go up. And so let's say that all of his siblings made it to adulthood, and they all had fewer kids. They weren't having 10, 11 kids themselves. But all of those 2 kids or 1 kid that they had, they made it to adulthood. And now they're procreating and adding 2 more kids. And they're replacing themselves once again. But I hope you can understand what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that in this transition, people are living longer and they're still having a whole lot of children. And while that birth rate is going to decline and go down, in between, you've got a family of like 10 kids who before only 3 of them would have procreated and made it to adulthood. But now 10 of them are procreating and making it to adulthood. And then those 10 are having 2. And then do you see, then the population is going to start to decline again. But it's this like huge push in population where we see big population growth. And that is not coincidentally, that happens because of a growth in economy, and that's also when we start to consume more. So now more people are living for longer, they're making it to adulthood, they're procreating, they're having children, and they're all going to consume at a higher rate, and that's the issue with population. So then what happens with the demographic transition model is we go into, this is an industrial economy, and now the birth rate starts to fall, people's cultural expectations catch up to what's going on inside their economy. And now in the post-industrial, where a place like the US is right now, where Japan is, where the UK is, now we have a low birth rate and a low death rate. So we basically met again. Here we had a high birth rate and a high death rate. In the end, we have a low birth rate and a low death rate. But the issue with population is when we start to live to adulthood, when we have these big families that are part of an old cultural concept that live to adulthood, procreate, have their own families, and all those people live to adulthood, and they are consuming at a much higher rate. Now, in no way am I saying, okay, so we shouldn't be consuming at a higher rate. We should be consuming with more green technology for sure. But what we need to see is these two go together. And we know that this happens. We know that birth rate stays up while death rate starts to decline. So if we know that, and if we go into a country like, let's say, Ethiopia, who has a projected economic growth in the next couple of years, and they are presumably, let's say in the next few decades, going to be at this part of their transition, If we were to go in there and couple their lower death rate with increased access to birth control, a really, really, you know, a really progressive campaign inside that economy saying, hey, take, you know, use condoms, get on birth control. Like as an economy is growing, having birth control with like really, really, really easy access. If we did that, then what we would see is the transition for places like Ethiopia from a poor place to a wealthy place without that growth in population. That's what we want to see. Because a lot of times people are like, oh, if all these countries get wealthy and if everybody is going to, be living a life that's one of quality, well, then we're not going to be able to survive. Well, if we couple these two together, then we will have fewer people. Plus, we need better technologies and all the stuff that we've talked about already. But if we couple these two together, then what we're going to see is less of a complicated demand on those resources. So I hope that you can understand what I'm trying to say. If not, then we can FaceTime, we can Zoom and have office hours. And I would like you to pause right now and watch the other TED Talk that I put on Canvas for this particular lecture, which is a TED Talk about where a man from Thailand talks about this exact thing that I'm discussing right now. So go on to Canvas. I think I labeled it as Mr. Condom because that's what he's called, Mr. Condom. But watch that. It's 10 minutes. It's really, really interesting. And it's about this exact issue that happens right here and how he and other people that worked with him looked at Thailand in the 1970s, saw that they were going to go into this decreased death rate and that they needed to couple the birth rate with the death rate. And they went from 7.7 children in the 70s to, I think, 2.2 now. It's exactly what we want to do in other parts of the world. Okay, so our factors influencing fertility. Hopefully you all understand what I'm talking about by factors influencing fertility. Some of those are economic. Some of those are things like just the expendable income to spend on birth control. A country that is wealthy enough to have good access to health care, all that kind of stuff. But other factors influencing fertility are cultural, or things like do we need the labor? Do we need to make sure that our children are going to live to adulthood because they need to take care of us when we're older? And obviously, you want your children to live to adulthood no matter what. But it's always interesting to me in class, and again, I'm so sad that we can't have this discussion in class, when I've had students throughout the years say things like, oh, well, in countries like Somalia, women just don't care that much about their children. They don't care if they're going to make it to adulthood. They're used to it. I really don't think that's true. I've had students say that for years and years. I've heard other people outside of the classroom say that, and I don't think that's true. I think that every person, every mother, unless you're a psychopath, you develop an attachment to your child and you want to see every one of them live. So this idea that somehow people who have death around them are more used to death, I think that that's dismissive and it kind of misses the crucial element to what makes us human. And that's exactly what we want to talk about in this class, is how we are human everywhere in the world. We all want the same thing. We all want to see our children happy, grow to healthy adults. We all want to work but not work too hard, and we all want to live a good life. The only difference is geography. Okay, so when we talk about population and the population of the world, right now we're at 7.7 billion people. 7.7 billion people. That is a lot of people. I know that's a lot of people. And if we look at this map back here, we're looking at population density. This is 2005, so it's a couple of years ago. And the population of the world has, I realize it's 15 years ago, the population of the world has increased, but this density, what we're looking at here, has really not changed so much. So while the numbers have changed, what this map is projecting, what it's visualizing, is density. So if we were in class, I would say, what do you notice in this map? And people would say things like, damn, there's a lot of people in China, or India has a lot of people. So what we're looking at is people per square mile. And you can see that I've made the circle, I think, in class before. I've said this. If not, if you don't remember, it's that there's more people who live inside this circle than outside. So there are over 3.5 billion people living inside this circle. So what happens inside this circle happens to the rest of the world. And there's never a better time, a better example than right now. You know, we have a global pandemic that started right in this area. So what happens in this part of the world happens to the rest of the world. If we look at climate change in the next couple of decades, or sorry, by the end of the century, we're looking at 5 meters, a 5-meter change in water level. So what is that going to mean for India right here? India has 1.2 billion people living in it. 70% of those people don't have access to a toilet, if you can imagine. We're fighting over toilet paper here, whereas people in India don't even have a toilet. What's going to happen with that 1 to 5 meter sea level rise for a population of 1.2 billion people? You might think that's their problem, but once again, we are all in this together, and so it's our problem as well. Not to mention, with climate change, South Asia is going to have a lot of other issues. Like they have a lot of water, they have plenty of rivers, but those rivers are fed by the Himalayas up here, and as the glaciers that run along the Himalayas that constantly feed the rivers in South Asia throughout the year melt, well, they're going to see flooding, and they're going to see a whole lot of flooding for several years, and then that snowpack is going to go away. So then they're going to see extreme drought. Over here in China, once again, when we look at climate change and 1 to 5 meters, look at that population right there that's going to be affected by that. Some of the biggest trade centers in the world are right in here. If we look at Japan, their population density, Japan is 140 million people. That's not that many people. That's the same population as Russia. But they are confined to 5 different cities. There's more, obviously. They're not just living in those 5 cities, but the majority of people, and you can see it in these red dots, are living in 5 different cities. That makes a huge difference for them. It makes a difference with access to resources. It makes a difference with quality of life. Japan is the 3rd biggest economy in the world, so it's behind China and it's behind the US, but quality of life, I would argue, is much higher. Now, you might think, no, in Tokyo or in other cities like that, everybody's packed in. Yeah, they're packed in, but at the same time, if you have the 3rd biggest economy in the world, but you only have 5 major cities that you need to make sure have the top-of-the-line hospitals, top-of-the-line transportation, well, that is a lot more, once again, I'll use this phrase, bang for your buck, so that you can actually utilize your resources much easier. I believe I've said this in class before, but just look at, with our gigantic economy, one of the big issues with getting, we have some of the best hospitals in the world here, but if you live right here and the best hospital is here, then you're kind of shit out of luck. And then if we think about the bullet train here in Japan, well, of course they have the ability to build this very fast train that gets people from city to city, because you're looking at a train that has to go across this much space as opposed to over here. So when we look at population density, there's a lot of different things that are going to factor in. And of course, your geography is the number one thing. What is your vulnerability to climate change? What does your geography look like? One of the reasons that Japan has these 5, mostly, like most of their population lives in these 5 cities, is because they're 90% mountains. So with those 90% mountains, you have these few valleys where they've created these incredible cities. Okay. I hope that you notice that not a lot of people live up here, and I hope that you can answer why. The answer is it's cold. And then same thing, if we were to look down here, again, there's more. If you look at the equator, where the equator is, sometimes the northern hemisphere is referred to as the continental hemisphere, the water hemisphere, versus the land hemisphere. And I hope you can see why, looking at this map. The majority of our land masses are up here in the northern hemisphere, whereas down here in the southern hemisphere, not so much. And then if you look at right here in Africa, there's not a lot of people living there, except if you're on the Nile. Look at that. And I hope you know the answer to that is it is hot and it is very dry. If we look over here, we're looking at the Amazon. So we're not going to have a whole lot of population living in the dense jungle of the Amazon. And then what's happening right in here are the Andes and the population distribution around these high elevations. Right here in Bolivia, that's the poorest country in South America, the population lives like right in this little spine. This is the spine of the Andes, basically. They're not living in the Amazon. They're not living in the orographic desert. That's a result of the Andes. They're living in like the kind of spine of livable space in Bolivia. So one thing to know about population, people tend to live by water. Fresh water, of course, because we all need fresh water, but also water for trade. And we don't like it too hot and we don't like it too cold. We're like Goldilocks. Okay. So we have our 7.7 billion people, and we're projected to grow to 11 billion people by the end of the century. But there's competing information on that. If we look at the International Institute for Applied Statistical Analysis, they actually have a lower number. We're supposed to get to 10 billion according to them. The UN, the United Nations, says that we're going to get to 11.2 billion. So their projections, when you look at the UN's projections of population, they always tend to be higher than the International Institute for Applied Statistical Analysis. But we're looking at a good number of people by the end of the century, and that's where population is supposed to plateau. So when we think about 11 billion, and you think like, what's going to happen in the next century? That's where we're supposed to plateau. And right now, we grow enough food for 11 billion people. I said that to you when we talked about agriculture, but we grow enough food for 11 billion people. We have 7.7 billion people, but we still have food insecurity. Well, why is that? One is across the board in different countries, we throw away about 30% of our food. Some of it's thrown away before it even gets to the table or to the store. And a whole lot of it is thrown away after it leaves the store. So if we were to look at like a pie graph of where that food waste is happening, it's happening at the production level, at the agricultural level, and it's happening like in the post-consumer level. So after we buy it, meaning that a lot of food doesn't make it to market because it's considered ugly or something like that. That's really like a real reason that food doesn't make it to market. And a lot of food doesn't actually get consumed after we buy it. Also, a whole lot of our food is being fed to other animals. We grow a lot of corn here, like just basically this is corn. And about 30% of that is just for animal consumption. So another big part of the issue that we're going to have with how are we going to feed 11 billion people is, well, we could feed 11 billion people right now. So what are we going to do to be more resourceful and responsible with the resources we're already creating? Plus, we're going to have to grow more than that. Okay, so oh shoot, I'm going to run out of batteries. Bear with me while I move. Sorry, I know this isn't compelling lecturing. How are you guys anyway? I miss you all. I miss being in class with you. Okay. All right. I plugged in my power source. Okay, so we have, man, what? Really? Now that's going to come up and distract us. Sorry about that. Oh, come on. Sorry. Okay. All right. So again, we look at population, and population 7.7 billion is a lot of people. But our population growth actually hit its high in the 1960s, and global population has been coming down since then. So if we look at our total fertility rate, We peaked in the 1960s. This is our total fertility rate in the 1960s, and our population has actually been going down. The issue is, like I said, while when we look at how many children are being born per woman around the world, that's going down. But the issue, like I said, is here is that as they're going down, you also have more people you also have this gap that happens where people go from having 10 children to 2 children, but those 10 children all make it to adulthood and consume at a much higher level and procreate themselves. So again, if we really want to look at what to do with population, because so often, like I said in the beginning of this lecture, people say, oh, population, the issue with that is there's just too many people in the world. Well, if you're actually really interested in wanting to reduce population, this is where it needs to be done, right in here. You need to watch the TED Talk on Mr. Condom if you haven't already, and you need to do something proactively about exactly what he did, which is coupling this birth rate with this death rate. That's where if we're actually concerned with population, that's what we should be doing. But so many people I find just like to complain about population because, like I said, it's veiled racism. It's an easy way to say, like, oh, it's just they're having too many people or whatever. It's kind of like people complain about abortion and they don't want abortion to happen. So they close birth control clinics, even though statistically, birth control clinics and birth control and access to birth control is the way to reduce abortion. So you have to ask, are you really concerned about abortion? If you want to see a reduction in abortion, but you're closing access to birth control. So same sort of thing with population. All right, so there's a big disagreement in, let's say, what's going to happen with Africa. So Africa is always a good example. People tend to use Africa as an example for everything, but especially when we talk about population. And once again, these guys over here, the UN has a higher projected growth for Africa than the International Institute for Applied Statistical Analysis. The total fertility rate per woman right now across the continent is 4.4. So while Somalia, like I said, is 9, if we looked across the continent, we're looking at an average of 4.4. And the UN thinks that that's going to take about 59 years to reduce to 2 children per woman. But the International Institute for Statistical Analysis has a much faster rate. And that disagreement has to do with a couple of things. It has to do with how economic growth affects the decline in the birth rate. So we know a couple of things about Africa. We know that health in Africa is improving rapidly. Once again, Africa is going through an economic revolution. So many different countries in Africa are seeing economic growth that is so incredibly high, like the 7.7% in Rwanda. And we've talked about why that is. A big reason is that technology has changed, and technology that used to be completely beneficial in the mid latitudes but didn't make sense in the low latitudes. Well, with technological change, for example, from the landline to the cell phone, we've seen the potential for growth in countries in Africa. So we see health improving rapidly. We're looking at a decline in fertility. The child mortality rate in Africa has halved over the last 2 decades. We have issues like HIV and AIDS, which is still a very serious threat. A quarter of the pregnant women in South Africa have HIV. So a full quarter of the pregnant women in South Africa today have HIV. And whether they're going to pass that on to their child has a lot to do with access to certain drugs. But we still see that this epidemic of HIV is past its peak in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're still seeing it fall. And again, a lot of that has to do with access to condoms, but it also has to do with cultural ideas. You had a lot of different, this cultural concept that having sex with a condom was not actually having sex, that you had to have skin to skin contact. And so what that led to, once again, you could have as many condoms as you want. You can be surrounded by condoms, but if people won't use them, you're not going to you're not going to you're not going to see a decline in things like HIV. And if people won't use them because of cultural ideas about skin to skin contact or whatever, then once again, it doesn't matter how much access you have to something. If you have this cultural concept that keeps you from using it, then you're in the same place. We also see malaria in a steep decline. It's almost halved in the last 15 years. So when we think about Africa, we are going to see declining birth rates, and we're going to see longevity, longer lives, and that's going to come with a couple of different things. Growth in economy that we're seeing right now, and Africa, countries in Africa, that's where we need to get in, and I mean African countries know this as well. But if we want to concern ourselves as geographers with global population, these are the places, these are the countries that we want to implement what Mr. Condom did in Thailand, which is coupling access to birth control and discussion about birth control. It's a really big thing. I know that students say stuff about me like that I just can't not talk about sex or something like that. But we live in a culture that is so prudish that simply won't talk about sex. And the problem with that is that if you don't talk about it, then you end up with issues around it. And so issues like how 1 out of 2 people who are under 25 in Santa Barbara are going to have an STI, and stuff like that. So in the same context, if we look at places like Thailand or places like Ethiopia, if we don't, you have to do more than just have condoms and birth control available. You also have to have an open discussion and a dialogue where we're no longer creating this cultural taboo around talking about sex and birth control. And I can see, like, even in our Santa Barbara, in this place where we all think that we're so amazingly woke and we're all comfortable with sex and all of that kind of stuff, that even when I talk about things like this in class, people are like, oh, she just can't stop talking about sex. Well, no, we need to talk about these things. Once you stop noticing that a discussion on birth control is somewhere out of the ordinary, then we've gotten to where we need to go. Do you know what I mean? Once you stop noticing and thinking that, like, that's abnormal that this professor would bring up condoms. How many times have I said condoms in this lecture? Once you stop thinking that's abnormal, that's when we're at the place we need to be when it comes to not just physical access to birth control and disease prevention, but also cultural. Does that make sense to you? So when we look at Africa, some crucial things are happening with hope in how their population is going to be affected by their economic growth. One is we have much better education than older generations. Now, we have this narrative that Africa people aren't educated, et cetera, but when we look at this younger population, they're staying in school longer, so this means that they're not like dropping out of school. They're much better educated than older generations, and all of that is coupled with like more access to certain technologies, birth control, et cetera, is looking hopeful when it comes to a decline in population. As they grow their consumption, we want to see a decline in population. That's for any growing economy. Okay, so here once again, I showed this in this there. It's the same graph. It's total fertility rate. This is broken apart by different countries. If you want to look at that for a second, we've got the world total fertility rate, but then depending on the country that you're in, obviously that fertility rate is going to be different. And if you look at these different countries, and Sub-Saharan Africa is not a country, we know that. Europe is not a country, but these 3 are countries. There's a big difference in what's going on in these different countries. Difference in like economic growth, for example. If we look at South Korea in 1950 versus South Korea today, South Korea in 1950 that's when the division of South Korea. That's when Korea went from being Korea to South and North Korea. They were in a war. They were in a conflict that was mostly between the Chinese and the US, but they were fighting it in Korea. If you want to learn more about Korea, take World Regional Geography from me. We talk about Korea a whole lot and why it divided and what that division means and stuff like that. But South Korea is the country that formed, North Korea and South Korea formed after the Korean War. And South Korea, went in a different direction from North Korea economically and politically, but it had a rough start. So South Korea is this kind of yellow. It had this rough start of they were similar to Vietnam in that there would have been landmines, there would have been, agricultural land would have been destroyed, not quite as bad as Vietnam, because in Vietnam we used certain tactics that, like we talked about with agriculture, that specifically destroyed the landscape and destroyed the soil. But here in South Korea, they would have been recovering from having their country torn apart, and so you see this growth in population. And now again, we're not seeing the death rate that went along with this. But then South Korea had a couple of stops and starts to their economy, and then in the 1970s is when their economy really starts to grow, and you can see how their population declines with it. And their economy now, South Korea is a very interesting place for a lot of reasons. That's why I love talking about it in World Regional Geography. I don't want to get too much into it in here, but this dip in population has everything to do with the growth in their economy. And with other things, like along with the growth in their economy came an increased access to education, but specifically for women. So again, I don't want to go too much into Korea, but just think that you had people who were, as the economy started to stabilize after the war, you had this increase in education, and it wasn't segregated by gender, and that growth of specifically female education as well is one of the reasons that this fertility rate dropped as much as it did. So one of the ways we can look at global population, but one of the ways that we look at population is through what's called a population pyramid. So this is a population pyramid. It's also called an age-sex ratio. So it has two names. One is population pyramid. One is age-sex ratio. And it's broken up like this, where you have male on one side, female on another side. So male, female. This is Brazil in 2009. And it doesn't matter that it's in 2009. We're not so much looking at the numbers as we're getting the concept of what a population pyramid is. And it's broken off into 5-year cohorts. So each one of these lines is a 5-year cohort. And with each one of these 5-year cohorts, you're looking at how many people were born in those 5 years. And you're looking at how many boys were born and how many girls were born. Okay, so if everything is just left on its own, if we're just procreating, nothing cultural coming in, nothing economic coming in, if we're just kind of if we're in like a hunter-gatherer society and we're procreating and everybody's in the same boat, then we're going to have a lot of children because not so much access to birth control. There's, ye olde time access to birth control, like the rhythm method going along with like a woman's menstrual cycle, or the pull-out method, where you pull out. That one doesn't work. If you don't believe me, you can ask my 12-year-old. I hope you guys got that joke. Okay, so if we are just procreating as usual, we're having a whole lot of kids, we're going to have more girls than boys. Biologically, there's more girls in a population than boys in a population. We actually all start out female. That's why we all have nipples. If you've ever wondered why men have nipples, it's because we all start out as female, and then some of us become male, still have the nipples, but then grow other accoutrements, and some of us stay women. They grow them. Sorry. And then if the population is moving along, some people will make it into adulthood. They'll live through adulthood. They'll start to die, have a heart attack here, maybe a stroke here. And then by the time we get to 80, 85, we're looking at pretty old people in the world. Um, I'm sorry, not pretty old people, but not that many people. That's what I meant to say. Um, okay, so this is a true pyramid. But what happens is with access to birth control, with access to, you know, if you have famine, if you have war, like all of this is going to be affected. So let's look at the UAE. And again, this is the same year as Brazil. We're looking at 2009. And in Brazil, 2009, you're going to have a lot of children born. A whole lot of them are going to make it to adulthood, and then we're going to see them taper off. If you notice, there's different bumps. So with this 5-year cohort right now, or right here, these people would be people who are 25. Clearly, something happened 25 years before 2009 to lead to a bump in population. It could have been something like a little global pandemic where we're all locked inside, or it could be something like, I don't know, maybe Brazil won the World Cup in 2008 or something like that. And then if you look at 15 years before 2009, clearly something happened where we didn't procreate as much. So again, this is a general trend in a population, but like 5-year to 5-year, you see little differences in what's happening inside that country. So back over here in the UAE, now this is a wonky looking pyramid. This isn't a, you know, this is an interesting looking pyramid. So I'd ask you guys what's going on. I'd ask y'all what's going on in this pyramid. Because you can see that not that many children are being born. Definitely not the number that we saw in Brazil, where we were looking at, we're looking at 8 children per woman, as opposed to what looks like 4 children per woman, maybe. And then again, we can look at these 5-year cohorts and see how there's kind of different bumps in the population. But what is going on with this? First of all, like I said, there should be more women in a population. That's not like what I think, like there just should be more women. Biologically, there just are more females in a population. So what is going on here? Because this is a what am I trying to say? Oh, I'm trying to say this isn't the norm. I can't remember the word I'm trying to say. This is a deviation. There we go. Deviation from the norm right here. And so I would ask the class what's going on here, and people would say things like, oh, country like the UAE, women are valued more than men, etc., etc. But then this population pyramid would look like this all the way up and down. It wouldn't have this like kind of weird, huge burst of men around 30, 25, 30, 35. So what's happening in the UAE in particular is it's a very, very, very wealthy country. It's 7 different emirates. Emirates like Dubai, like Abu Dhabi, those are all part of the UAE. And they are very wealthy, and they're very wealthy on oil. And so what happens is this very similar thing happens in Saudi Arabia, that a lot of the population of the UAE are wealthy enough that they're not doing the jobs that are needed in an economy like construction, like janitors, like drivers, like all of those kinds of jobs that that people do at different levels of socioeconomic pay and stuff like that. When you have a really wealthy country and people are like, I'm not going to be a janitor, what you do is you import your labor. And what's happening here is we're looking at a couple of things. We're looking at a preference for male workers because you are in the UAE. And while the UAE is a more liberal country than, let's say, Saudi Arabia, it still has a male preference and an idea of like who should be going to work, who should be doing paid work, I should say. And so you're looking at a demand for paid labor, and particularly paid labor that is male. And so what we're going to see in here, this population is going to be a lot of Sri Lankans, Bangladeshi people, South Asian people in general. That's what is going to be factored into this population, this like large blue bump. Okay, we talked about the demographic transition model. Let's talk about, once again, about the cultural idea of something like birth control, because there's simply access to it. But let's look at this. This is fascinating. This is a vasectomy. You all know what a vasectomy is. If you don't know what a vasectomy is, go look it up. But it's how men can sterilize themselves, right? Not sterilize yourself. You're not doing it to yourself, but you know what I mean. It's permanent sterilization for men. The birth control pill, which I think you're all familiar with, is this incredible, revolutionary piece of biotechnology. What it allowed for, what it allowed for was temporary, temporary infertility. That was something that had never been heard of before. And the reason that that's so revolutionary is that it allows you, so temporary infertility, it allows you to control, obviously, that's why it's called birth control, but it allows you to control your fertility probably in some like your most fertile years. So it allowed people 19, 20, 22 years old, where they would be very fertile, to to remain infertile for a period of time, for a period of their choosing. And this is something that is so important, because before that we'd always had the option of sterilization, but most 18-year-old women are not going to be sterilized. They're not going to be permanently sterilized. They're just like never going to have children. Most 18-year-old women, want to leave that option open. So the access to temporary infertility, just imagine what it did. It was this technology that in so many different ways changed society. If you look at when the birth control pill goes on the market, it's 1960. And in 1960, it was illegal for the birth control pill to. It was legal to have birth control. It was illegal to buy birth control. Women were not allowed to buy birth control. Men were allowed to buy condoms. And starting in 1919, that's when men were first allowed to buy condoms in the US. And it was only sailors. It was only men who worked in like the Marines or the Merchant Marines who were allowed to buy condoms. And then eventually all men could buy condoms. But in 1960, women were not allowed to purchase their own birth control. So they had to market the pill as something that regulated your period. And in the like subtext, when you're listening to a pharmaceutical ad and they're like, may cause blah, 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 part of that subtext may cause temporary infertility. It wasn't until 1965 that it was legal for married women to purchase their own birth control. So, and you had to be married. And it wasn't until 1972. 1972. That's the year my daughter, not my daughter. That would be weird. That was the year my sister was born. All three of my husbands. 1972 is when you could purchase birth control as a single woman. So when we think about birth control, once again, part of it, the technology was there, but we had a society that said women shouldn't have this control over their body. They shouldn't be able to control, how many children they're going to have. And I hear this still. I hear this from other parents who say things like, "Oh, if you give kids access to birth control, if you put condoms in your office or something like that, you're just encouraging sex." Please, like, anybody needs to encourage sex among 19-year-olds or among 16-year-olds or whatever. So when I say the cultural part, that's a big part of the culture. It's the idea of like who has the right to birth control, who has the sensibility, and all of that. And if you look at like the changes in women in the last couple of decades since birth control has been legalized, and there's been more birth control, and there's been, most importantly, temporary infertility when it comes to birth control. Just look at the growth in women's education in this country since then. Look at the growth in so many different aspects of women's lives. In 1978, 50%, no, I think it was 60% of Americans said that it was a man's right to beat up his wife. And, it's nowhere near that high now. And a big part of that is because once women had access to more education, because they were able to put off their having children, they had economic independence. And so if you were in an abusive relationship, that gave you just one more step out the door, where you're able to say, like, I don't need you financially. If you're going to beat the crap out of me, then I'm going to leave. And so you start to see spousal abuse decline. That doesn't mean that it's gone, but you start to see it decline. So when we think about access to birth control, not only is that access highly cultural, it also changes a culture so fundamentally. So let's look at this, what's happening here. We got our what's called the vasectomy gap. So male sterilization versus female sterilization. So this is not talking about the birth control pill. This is talking about getting your tubes tied, getting something that permanently disables you from being able to have children. And usually people do that after they've had 1 or 2 children. So if we look at the UK, we have a lot more men getting vasectomies than women getting their tubes tied. Now, men getting a vasectomy is only about $1,000 in this country versus about $7,000 for a woman to get her tubes tied. So we're looking at $1,000 versus $7,000. It's also much more complicated for a woman to get her tubes tied than it is for a man to get a vasectomy. A vasectomy, there's a little snip, a little soldering, and boom, it's done, as opposed to what has to happen that is more invasive, often more painful, can lead to really severe cramping for women, can lead to like irregular periods, irregular bleeding. And so if you look at the UK, it reflects that. It's more expensive and it's more complicated for the woman, so more men are getting sterilized. Once again, in Canada, same thing. It's more expensive, it's more complicated, so fewer women and more men are having this permanent sterilization. But over here in the US, it flips. So here in the US, we're looking at, even though it's more expensive and more painful, way more women are getting sterilized than men. And if we were in class, I would ask you why that is, and we'd hear all kinds of answers. But think about these things. Think about what this says. The cultural responsibility of whose job it is to take care of birth control. A lot of that is reflected right in here. This cultural idea that women get pregnant, women need to stop themselves from getting pregnant. It's not so much our role, it's their role. And I know that maybe you don't think like that, but I have students almost every semester who say like, well, it's like a woman's problem. I had a student say that in World Regional last semester where I talked about like why people should care about birth control, why men should care about birth control. And this guy was like, I shouldn't, it's not my problem. It's like, it is if you're having sex with a woman. What the hell are you talking about? Anyway, so this shows, this again reflects culturally on whose responsibility it is to prevent birth. And then I would say this also has to do with some masculine idea of like balls. And even though your balls are not being removed when you're sterilized, you still have them. They're still intact. I think a part of this has to do with masculinity and, I don't know, perceived ideas of masculinity. So there we go. All right. So the one-child policy that happened in China. Again, I would really like it if you paused right now and went and watched the John Oliver one-child policy news piece that I posted on Canvas. That would be great because it would inform you a whole lot in what we're talking about. But the one-child policy is something that is so fascinating. Okay, so China, big country, big economy, all kinds of stuff happening in China. China, if we look at how this starts in 1950 and goes to 2025, this is really important. Now, most of our total fertility graphs have started in 1950, so this is normal, but at the same time, a lot changed in 1948 in China. The People's Revolution happened in 1948, and with the People's Revolution, you had this very old civilization, one of our 3 oldest civilizations in the world, that had been an agrarian economy for the majority of the population, had been working in an agrarian economy for that entire time. So for thousands of years, you had the majority of the population working in agriculture. And you had a few people, it was a dynasty, so you had basically a few royal families who controlled the land and controlled most. If you controlled the land in an economy like that, then you also controlled politics. So then they have a revolution, and in that revolution, you have a communist economy attempted. You have Mao come to power. You have a lot of the wealthy, the few kind of smaller percentage of Chinese people who were wealthy and targeted flee to Taiwan. That's why Taiwan becomes a country. and other people flee to the US or to other parts of the world. But the people who stay in China, what happens is you have Mao come to power. And again, if we were in World Regional, I would talk about what Mao does. He does so much that affects their environment, that affects their economy. But I want to make this point because a lot of times when people talk about population, they think, okay, population leads to environmental distress. And I want to give you China as an example because China is the most environmentally distressed country in the world, and it's also the biggest population. So people are always often like, look at that, there's your evidence. Biggest population, worst environment. But what happens here with China is when Mao comes to power, he needs to do so much to take over their economy, to create a communist economy, and also to industrialize because they hadn't industrialized yet. And so he has all these stops and starts to their economy where basically he reclaims all the land and he parcels it out to these mom and pop farms. And that doesn't last very long because they find that those mom and pop farms can't support the urban population and the military. So then after that, he reclaims the land again and he creates something called the village communes. And those village communes are like, they're basically like little townships where everybody lives in their township. You can't leave without permission. You get your education, your healthcare there. You all work in that township. Now, when Mao came to power, the average person in China lived to be 35, if you can imagine. So 35 was the projected lifespan. And so one thing that he said while he was kind of stopping and starting the economy was have lots of children. It's your duty as a Chinese person to have a lot of children. So you have him trying to restructure the economy, trying to industrialize, and the Chinese way copied the Soviet way. So the Soviets also, Russia, when the Russian Revolution happened, they hadn't industrialized. They had to industrialize real fast. And their idea was, Stalin had said, he said about nature, he said, you can't trust nature to give us its bounty, you must tear it from her. So a little rapey. But that was his view of the environment, was we have to basically beat it into submission. And that was the same idea that China followed in the beginning, which was, okay, let's industrialize, but let's industrialize big, let's industrialize fast. And the toll that took on the environment was incredible. Big dams, big factories, right? The rerouting of tributaries to lakes, the stopping of a river flowing, and a river creates this entire ecosystem along its path. Let's stop that and dam it. And all of that had this huge effect on the environment. So when we look at how China kind of like stopped and started its agrarian economy, demanded that people have a lot of children, and industrialized super fast, that was the really, really big factor in the environmental distress. It's not the population so much. It's how their economy grew and what they did to destroy their environment as they were growing their economy, from industrializing to also farming and to some of the policies that Mao implemented. It really created this destructive. It had this destructive effect on their environment. So that when the one child policy comes in here, I'm going to get to that in just a minute, you already had this destroyed environment from Mao's stops and starts to the environment, to the economy that had destroyed the environment. And then you had this like degraded environment, and then you had what led to, then you had the one child policy start, and then you had like the growth of the economy start. So you had an increase in consumption with coupled with this degraded economy, and we're looking at real issues when it comes to the environment and stuff like that. But anyway, so I just wanted to quickly kind of say how it's easy to blame the population of China for their environmental distress, but what it has to do with is what was going on in the country in these decades and the economic development that they pursued. Because the second worst environments in the world is Russia. And Russia, with only 140 million people, as opposed to 1,300,000,000 people, they have the second worst environmental issues. It has to do with their economic policies in the 1950s and 1960s. Okay, so what's happening right here is the Great Famine. One of the things that happened with Mao is like I said, he created those village communes, and the idea was little these little villages where you couldn't leave unless you had um, access to a pass or something like that. You got everything, education, healthcare, in that village commune, and you were producing agriculture. And there was one person in charge of that village commune who would report back to the central government, and they would give the surplus of what was being grown and made in those village communes to the central government to distribute among the urban populations and the military. And what happened is you looked better if you were reporting to the central government and you like brought them more food, basically, like, look at how productive my village commune is. But what was happening is they were taking away the food from the people working on the commune. And so you had these people in the commune who were suffering because they were producing all this food and it was being given away as a quote unquote surplus, but it wasn't a surplus, it was the food that they needed to survive. So you saw about 30 million people starve in this period of time. That's what leads to this like boom, this drop in fertility, because while people are starving, people are not procreating. And then we go into regional self-sufficiency and we see kind of a boom in population. This period of starvation ends and we see the population again like grow, looking at 7 children per woman. But the population was in decline going into the one-child policy. So it's interesting that they started the one-child policy to begin with. And they started it because a person who was high up in the government went to Sweden and saw this whole uh, well, lecture that somebody gave on how there's too many people in the world. Basically, this whole idea that like everybody just needs to stop having children. And while that person's research and their statistical analysis was debunked later, so the person who made this presentation in Sweden basically made a presentation saying we need to cut the population of the world or else we're going to have these dire consequences. And while his research was all debunked, these top officials in the Chinese government went back to China and said, we got to implement like a one-child policy right away. I just saw this whole presentation. It was terrible. We got to stop people from having children right now, or else we're going to have some serious problems. So they start the one-child policy, which at first was voluntary. You should only have one child. But after a couple of years, it became mandatory. And so you could only have one child, just one child. And the problem with that is, which child do you want to have? If you have a culture that, again, was agrarian for thousands of years, what do you think their cultural preference? Their cultural preference would be to have a lot of children, right? Like we talked about in Africa. If you have an agrarian economy, it's very labor intensive and you want to have more children. But you also had the same idea that your children take care of you in your old age, in your retirement. So you want to have children because they take care of you in your retirement. The twist in China was that China is still based in this Confucius ideology. So Confucius was this philosopher a long time ago who kind of set up the fundamental ideas of Chinese culture. And Chinese culture is different from Western culture in the sense that Western culture is in many ways about individuality, whereas Chinese culture is about my place in society. And my place in society has a lot to do with my gender and my birth order. So, and of course, there's socioeconomic, there's land holdings that come in with that, but there's a lot more to it than that. But your gender and your birth order have a lot to do with what you're going to do in your life, what your role in your family and your community is. And so if you're the firstborn male, then your duty is to take care of your children. Or sorry, everybody needs to take care of their children. Your duty is to take care of your parents. So if you don't have a firstborn male, what is your retirement plan? Do you see the issue? So culturally, you wanted to have a lot of children because they were economically, they were helpful to your labor-intensive economy. But you also wanted to have a firstborn boy because it was his responsibility to take care of you when you got old. So, what happens when you can only have one child? You have one child in a country that has a son preference, an SON, son preference. And that son preference has everything to do with this cultural idea of who takes care of you. So, what happens is you have a whole lot of girls who go missing. So, we have about an estimated 163 million girls who aren't in the world today. And where did they go? Well, if you watched that piece on John Oliver, which you need to do, you'll learn like all the different parts of that. How you had girls who were abandoned and left for dead. You had a rise in abortions. In fact, this is the period of time where the ultrasound becomes a technology that allows us to know the sex of our child before they're born. And because you had so many abortions of female fetuses after the ultrasound, it's actually illegal still to find out the sex of your child in China because of that. So, this one child policy led to so many issues. And one of the biggest issue is missing girls. Girls who were abandoned, girls who were left for dead. I've had multiple students through the years who were adopted from, I had this one student who was adopted by Swedish parents. She grew up in Sweden, but she was found in a garbage can in a train station. I had another student who her parents just never recorded her birth because one way that you got around the one child policy and the heavy taxation that happened as a result, and also this shame, was just to not record that you have a child. So you have, if you watch the John Oliver piece, you'll see how many projected people are actually walking around in China today with zero record of their birth, and the kind of problems that that's going to create with access to education, access to documents that, like, you're not a person without those documents. So another big issue that's happening right now, besides the missing girl issue, is you have a tiny population that came behind. So if we go back to our population pyramid, if you imagine China, China is going to have in fact, let me just look that up real quick. Da, 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 da. There we go. Ooh. So looking at our, what the hell is that? Okay, there we go. So looking at what happened, so this is 2018, a couple of years ago. But what you have is a much smaller generation following a pretty big generation. And so what happens with this population as they get older? Because while the average person lived to 35 when Mao came to power, by the time Xiaoping came to power in the late 1970s, the average Chinese person was living to 70. So you had people who were going to live a lot longer, and they were being followed by a much smaller population. So what does that mean for this smaller population? As this smaller population goes into, their 20s, their 30s, into their 40s, what's happening to them is they're responsible for aging parents. So their parents could only have one of them, which means that so many households in China right now are part of a 4-to-1 ratio. 4 parents, so 4 like senior parents, 2 adults. So let's imagine like my Chinese counterpart, like the Chinese version of me right now, living in China with a spouse, and with our 4 aging parents living at home, and then our 1 child. So you have so much stress on the Chinese version of me right now, where they are responsible for their 4 aging parents, as well as raising their child behind them, as well as keeping an economy stable as their parents continue to get older and need more health care and aren't contributing to the economy. You see the problem there? So, with that son preference that I talked about a minute ago, that led to these 163 million missing girls, projected million missing girls, one issue that's happened is and again, you'll see this from the one child policy thing that I posted on Canvas. But you have like way more boys now, or men, they're men, um, than women. And what that leads to is a whole lot of bachelors, a whole lot of people who just can't get married. There just aren't enough women to marry them. Um, and so if you are getting engaged today in China, if you're a Chinese woman and you get engaged, you you have the whole expectation of a ring that we talked about in class when we talked about diamonds. But then you also are going to, if you're going to get engaged to a girl, you need to give her a ring, a car, and a house. That's no joke. A ring, a car, and a house before you even get married. This is what you're presenting as part of your whole engagement ceremony. You know, where you've got like some white horse and rose petals and all that kind of crap. Plus, you got like a car and a house in the distance. So, what is so amazing about what's happened in China in the last 40 years, or one of the amazing things, is that who do you think pays for that house and that car? It's the parents. So, what has happened now with the Chinese, version of me in China is that they don't want a boy. They want a girl. Because yeah, a boy's going to take care of you in retirement, but before that happens, he has to get married. And if he's going to get married, you have to buy somebody a freaking car and a house in order for that to happen. So, what we see today in China is a daughter preference. So, 6,000 years of son preference changed in one generation. So, when we think that culture is stagnant and certain things just aren't going to change, certain ideas aren't going to change, when your economy changes, your culture changes real fast to catch up with whatever is most economically viable. Um, India also had policies of sterilization. They weren't like the one child policy in that they weren't like a blanket uh, sterilization, like everybody, or sorry, it wasn't like a blanket mandate that everybody have one child. It was different pockets of India, and India is our most stratified country in the world. I said earlier that 70% of the Indian population does not have access to a toilet. Whereas you have like very, very wealthy people in India, some of the wealthiest people in the world. That has everything to do with economic stratification that comes from cultural justifications in Hinduism that we'll get into later when we talk about religion. But so there were pockets of like the poorest people in India who were sterilized, and some of them forced sterilized, some of them incentivized with like get sterilized and we'll give you a radio. And that happened here too. Like the U.S. has a history of sterilizing black women, sterilizing black men, sterilizing Native American men and women, sterilizing very, very poor people in the US. We also have this history of kind of selective sterilization. So when I ask, could that policy exist here in the US? People are often like, no. And then I say, oh, it did. So when we look at the population and we look at our different theories on population, first we have Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus was this clergyman who, in the 18th century, who thought that we needed to cut off population right away, that people needed to stop having children. There was too many children in the world, and we needed to stop having those children. And once again, it was this idea that poor people have too many children. Those poor people, those children take up like too much of social resources, et cetera, et cetera. And so he really focused his anti-population theory on the poorest people in the world. And you can still see that today with people like my dad who talk about how there's too many people in the world. That's why I say it's masked racism. It's masked whateverism, whether it's discrimination against poor people, whether it's discrimination against people of certain cultural origins or ethnic origins or national origins. It's some people. It's selection and like who has the right to have children and who doesn't. Population ecology is the idea that we have an interaction with our natural environment and we have to live within our ecosystem. Now, that's intuitive, of course. The difference with us as humans is that we have this incredible ability to change our environment. We have these brains that have allowed us to continue to manipulate the environment manipulate and grow technologies that allow us to grow our population within the same environment. So, like the same environment that supported 1 billion people a couple hundred years ago now supports 7 billion people. So, with population ecology, what it doesn't necessarily look at is how we manipulate our environment and whether that is sustainable and whether we can create a sustainable manipulation. And I know manipulation isn't a good word, but a can we live on this planet? And we can, absolutely. We have the technology to live on this planet in a way that supports our population and does so in what we would call biomimicry. We can mimic the way that the environment does things. We think that we improve on the environment by creating these new systems and with this idea that the economy is like a completely different system and humanity is a completely different system from the environment, ignoring that we are a subsystem of the environment. So if we mimic nature, if we do things, if we use our green technology, if we copy, let's say, the way a tree, I know this sounds super hippie, but what a tree does to cool itself, which is uses gravity and the circulation of water throughout its little tree body to keep itself cool. We have that same technology we can use to cool a building. And within a building, if we imagine like our buildings like a tree and our cities like forests, I know again that sounds super hippie, but that's the kind of technology that's going to lead us to supporting our population rather than just thinking about sterilizing our poor people. Okay. So neo-Malthusianism, once again, the idea that we have too many people in the world, that those people, if they can't take care of their children, if they don't have the financial resources, if they live in a poor country, they really shouldn't be having children. Instead of viewing all the other ways that we can give access to choice, if you know what I mean. There's one thing to tell people how many children they should have. There's another thing to make sure people have the choice of education, the choice of birth control. Carrying capacity has to do with how many people can be supported in a square mile. And again, that has a whole lot to do with geography. If you're in Arizona and you're in the middle of a desert, your carrying capacity is much less than if you are in a place with fertile soil. If you're in, let's say, I want to say Switzerland, but it gets pretty cold in Switzerland. But if we're in a place that has good fluvial geography, good rivers, good soil, our carrying capacity is going to be very different. Way more people can be supported in that kind of landscape than in the middle of a desert. Cornucopian theory, that's the idea that I was just sort of talking about with there's enough matter and energy on the earth to provide for our population. We just need to use it wisely. That's what I was getting to with my whole hippy dippy idea of like buildings should be like trees and our city should be like forests. It goes along with that cornucopia theory that we have the matter, we have the energy. We just need to utilize it in a way that doesn't destroy the environment and allows us to take care of our population. So that is where I'm going to leave. Oh, wait, no. I need to talk about immigration for 1 second. So immigration is another way that immigration, actually I'm going to come back to this when I talk about ethnicity. So when I talk about ethnicity, I want to talk about immigration and push and pull factors. So this is where I will leave our population talk for this week. Please watch those 3 videos that I mentioned. They're all on Canvas. The population Hans Rosling TED Talk, the Mr. Condom TED Talk, and John Oliver talking about the one-child policy. Remember that you have a quiz on Thursday the 2nd. It is on A Path Appears episode 3. I hope that you are all doing well. I miss being in class so much, and I miss all of your faces. And please contact me if you have any questions, if you want to discuss this lecture. And that's it. Next time I post, it will be on language. All right. How do I turn this off?